Alright, so we are back, of course, to talk about some Final Fantasy VII Remake. We actually had two different things come out today. We had the second part to that special interview series we talked about a couple days back, the Deep Lore or whatever. And we also got another interview with Naoki Yamaguchi talking about them rebuilding Midgar for Final Fantasy VII Remake. And I'm not really sure why both of these came out today. Like, stuff like this should be coming out a day or two apart. That's how you drip feed information. That's how you keep people interested, keep people talking about your game. I don't know why they put these both out today. But for today, we're just going to talk about one of them, because last time we did the special interview video, it was like almost 12 minutes long. So if we do both of these articles together, both these interviews together, it's probably a really long video, and I don't want to do that. So I think we're just going to talk about the Midgar one for today. And then we'll do part 2 of the special interview series either tomorrow or the next day or something. But of course, let's just hop right into it. Before we talk about how we reimagine Midgar, we should probably answer a question many fans have had. Why do it at all? After all, the original backgrounds of Final Fantasy VII are burned in our collective memories, why not simply remake them in 3D? The short answer is, we couldn't. Converting the 2D backgrounds of the original game into 3D actually revealed a lot of structural contradictions. Even in a fantasy world, the buildings and environments had to hang together believably. That simply wasn't the case with the old environments. We realized that we couldn't create a convincingly realistic Midgar without resolving these contradictions. That was the main driving force behind our decision to reimagine so much of the city. Of course, making the decision to recreate and expand the city is one thing, actually doing it is quite another. Now, when he talks about there being structural contradictions, I'm not entirely sure what he means. The first thing I can think of, though, is like in the Sector 7 slums, there's a lot of like small but tall buildings, and maybe that wasn't very logical when they tried to put it into like a realistic setting, a 3D world. Because if you look at the 7th Heaven Bar in the original game versus the remake, you can see they proportioned the building better and made it not quite as tall. You also have in Sector 7 Slums the building in the bottom right that has the shop and also the Beginner's Hall. It's another like really tall but skinny building. They have it in Remake, but perspective-wise it's not nearly as big. And I'm not even sure if that's the kinds of things that he's talking about when he talks about structural contradictions, but that's the first thing I think of. And I also think they proportioned the Schindler Building a lot better for Remake. Our first step for designing Final Fantasy VII Remake's Midgar was to look at the scale of the city. We needed to convey the idea of realistic proportions, so an early priority was to establish things like the height and depth of the buildings. To do this, we tried out an interesting idea. We took an aerial photograph with the rooftop of Square Enix's office building in Shinjuku, Tokyo at the very center. We overlaid this with diagrams of Midgar, with the Square Enix roof taking the place of the Schindler Building. This let the development staff imagine the scale of Midgar compared to real life, and they were able to use this aerial image as a point of comparison for how densely we should fit buildings together, while keeping the proportions as realistic as possible. Also with that part to give us a couple pieces of concept art for Midgar, which is kind of cool. They're not the best quality because they're kind of small on the article itself, and it's all in Japanese so we can't read it, which kind of sucks as well, but it's still kind of cool. But that part goes to show you the level of detail and effort they put into remaking Midgar for Final Fantasy VII Remake. They used one of their own buildings for like a comparison to kind of get an idea of how big the building should be, proportion, how close the building should be. Now, I personally think it makes a lot more sense to use an actual really big building if you're trying to do something that's supposed to be the Schindler Building, because the headquarters isn't really that big of a building in terms, it's not like a skyscraper, it's not like 100 floors or something. That being said, obviously they handled it just fine, and Midgar is great and the Schindler Building is great, but I would have used like a really, really tall building if I'm trying to like replicate what the Schindler Building would be like in the center of Midgar. That wasn't the one time we used the real world to influence the look and feel of Midgar. We took inspiration from many cities all over the world that we felt captured the spirit of Final Fantasy VII. We wanted Midgar and Final Fantasy VII Remake as a whole to have a kind of jumbled together, eclectic and fun atmosphere. For that, we took particular inspiration from Tokyo. For example, some people may already know this, but the game's wall market is heavily influenced by Shinjuku's Kabukicho area. Maybe saying that right? I don't know. Additionally, the team explored Tokyo looking for odd cityscapes, strange architecture, and interesting scenery. You know, the kind of thing where you have no idea how it even ended up that way. Then these got compiled into reference documents. That was a pretty fun part of development. So right here's just a quick Google image search of Kabukicho, and if you hop back to wall market, you can definitely see the influence here. Something I'd like them to do if they haven't already, like maybe in one of the Ultimanias or something like that, is like give us more examples of real-world locations and buildings that they use for reference for the remake. I'd love to like look at the in-game versions versus the real-life versions. That's fascinating to me. But I do imagine that is a pretty fun part of video game development, is when you get to like travel around the world. And in this case, they didn't really go too far because they're still in Japan and Tokyo. But getting to like travel around and look at like different buildings and structures and locations for like ideas for your video game. At the start of development, the game designers and scenario writers created documents that detail the setting and the world, including the economic status of the different regions. This information was invaluable in helping us to find which elements of the environment could be shared across areas and which should be region-specific, right down to the ratio of text on the posters. We also realized that the lighting would play a vital role in helping to differentiate the areas. For example, Mako Reactor 1 is the oldest of the Mako reactors. Most of the lighting here was made to look like mercury vapor lamps, which have been around for a long time. In contrast, Mako Reactor 5 is comparatively new. Most of the lighting here was made to look kind of bluish, like LEDs. Mako is still the energy source for both, but by using real-life lighting as a reference like this, we were able to represent the unique characteristics of the different regions and their own identities within Midgar. So this is absolutely a fantastic bit of detail that I never would have picked up on if they never pointed it out. And maybe it's meant to be like a subconscious type of thing that you realize without realizing it. But they use old school lighting in the first Mako reactor because it is the oldest Mako reactor. That was probably the technology at the time when they started building it. And then as they progressed through building Midgar when they got to Sector 5, they had much more modern lighting like LEDs. Just props to Square Enix, man, for putting so much detail into this game. It's such a small thing that I'm sure not a single person would have noticed if they didn't point it out. Another way we helped give the locations their personality was to add lots of small environmental details to each place you visit. Every place is packed with these little touches. They're easy to miss, but they add realism and atmosphere to each area. That said, I hope some of you did notice them because a huge amount of effort went into their creation. Take the posters, for example. The team got really into this part of the process and were resubmitting new designs all the way through development, even after we finished the game. Another good example of them using posters to add like personality and detail to the world was the Benora White Apple Juice poster that was in like the train station at the beginning of the game, which is a reference to, of course, Crisis Core. And people noticed this Easter egg during the demo, and who knew going into the full game that we were going to get a lot more Zack than that. The graffiti got the team similarly excited, including our localization team. We asked them to write us some playful phrases from the perspective of the inhabitants of Midgar, which we then used in the game. The stuff they came up with was brilliant. Some of my favorites include, I once came to Midgar in search of riches, but now I wallow alone in its ditches. It no longer matters what words I utter, because none will get me out of the gutter. And life can get you down even after you've grown up, which I don't recall seeing any of these anywhere. And they're going to give us some more examples of some graffiti within Final Fantasy VII Remake, and I guess I just didn't really pay attention because none of this looks all that familiar. The only one I was looking out for when it came to Remake was the area in Wall Market where you climb up to the Schindler Building. I was looking for that wall with the graffiti. In the original game, was it a mistranslation right here? Because it looks like the reddish pink is supposed to say Avalanche, but it's AVER. And then if you look at the remake, it actually says Avalanche on that wall. I guess I've just never really heard anybody point this out as like a mistranslation in FF7, but I think it is. Similar to like this guy, Arsic or Eris. One of the new areas was the Sector 7 Upper Plate Residential Zone. Early on, we knew that we wanted to focus on the members of Avalanche to a much greater extent to the original game, and featuring Jessie's family's home was a great way to explore her history and give players more information about the city itself. This new area was developed as employee housing for workers at the Schindler Electric Power Company, so we took inspiration from real-life residential areas that have a lot of identical buildings crammed together. We were very careful to get the feeling of this area right because the collapse of the Sector 7 plate is a hugely important part in the story. By having a memorable location that the player has actually visited to be one to collapse, it gives the event more of an impact and makes it feel even more real. And I think that was a fantastic choice. Make us go to the Sector 7 residential area. We get to visit with Jessie's parents, get to know them, see her dad on his deathbed, essentially sick with Mako poisoning, and then the collapse of Sector 7 later. That just adds so much more weight to that scene, if it didn't already have that. Even when it came to the original game with the fall of Sector 7, it's still a heavy scene, right? Like, it's a lot of people dying in that moment, but you didn't have Jessie's parents. You didn't have the connection to that location like you do with the remake. We obviously had a connection to the Sector 7 slums, but we had no idea or knowledge of the Sector 7 upper plate, which I think is a fantastic addition to the story. Of course, to create a truly believable Midgar, we needed to do more than just design things like the buildings and scenery. The people matter too. In fact, this element of the city was considered just as important as the others. Right from the start, we created information about each part of the city, including the economic status of its residents. This helped us create a consistent look and feel for the inhabitants in those areas. In addition, it's important to me that the inhabitants didn't just stand around passively. If you look closely, the people actually interact with different elements of the environment. This in particular was difficult for the team, and it took a lot of repeated adjustments, but in the end, I think it was worth it as it really breathes life into the city. Now, I can certainly agree that they did a great job with the inhabitants of Midgar. I don't recall if there's any repeated like NPCs like you'd see in almost like a Grand Theft Auto or something like that. I can't recall because there's different people in different sectors, so I imagine they're all pretty diverse. But what I think hurts the game in terms of making the city feel realistic and alive is the fact that it is a linear game. Like, it is realistic as you want to make it or try to make it feel when you're walking down corridors the entire time and there's invisible walls and rubble that you can't surpass because the game doesn't allow you to. That's where it kind of hurts it, man. That's where I lose that like immersion into the world. So hopefully with the sequels where we think it's going to be relatively open world, if they can take what they did in the first game in the linearity of Midgar and expand it to a semi-open world to open world style game, I think it'll be perfect. The final element of designing Midgar I want to talk about is the Schindler Building. You'll notice that this imposing structure is visible from all over the city, and we paid special attention to the layout to make sure that that was the case. The building is so important to the climax of the game, they wanted to always be there as kind of a cinematic foreshadowing, so we designed each area to ensure players always had an eyeline to it. As well as the building, we also created the entire plaza around it, but players never got to visit it. Early on in development, the plan was that Cloud and the others would enter the Schindler Building from the main entrance, like in the original, so we actually made all the assets for the plaza. However, since we planned that section around stealth, it was difficult to make the story flow naturally. Considering it was an infiltration mission, we decided that it made more sense to reimagine it and have them enter from the underground car park instead. I think this was ultimately a good decision, as it allowed us to focus on representing the Schindler Building in ways that hadn't been shown in the original. At least we didn't completely lose all that work. You can see the plaza in the distance when sneaking into the building. So them designing the areas in the maps to always kind of point you towards the Schindler Building, so it's kind of always there imposing, is another sort of subconscious thing, maybe similar to the lighting stuff that we talked about earlier, where you don't really notice it, but subconsciously you do. The prime example I can think of, the first thing that comes to mind, is the airbuster fight. The entire time you're fighting him on that bridge, you see the Schindler Building in the background. And when it comes to us not actually being able to explore the plaza, the front of the Schindler Building, that does suck, but I did like the new thing. I did like the new addition of us going to the underground car park and doing something different from the original game, though I was looking forward to going in through the front door. And lastly, we have Hamaguchi's final thoughts, which we'll just read over really quickly. He says, "I hope that gave you an interesting insight on how we rebuilt Midgar for Final Fantasy VII Remake. When I look back over the development, I'm proud that we were able to portray areas of the city that had been off-screen in the original Final Fantasy VII, such as the underside of the plate and more in-depth portrayals of the city and its residents. I imagine that a lot of people had their own ideas about what these parts of the city were like, so in a sense it was quite nerve-wracking to explicitly show them. But since we put so much thought into the scale and making the city feel realistic, I think that we were ultimately successful in bringing it to life in the way we wanted. Thanks for reading, and I hope you have fun exploring the city of Mako." But dudes, that is pretty much the video. That's the entire article, interview, whatever you want to call it. It ended up being another long video, which means it's going to be another probably late upload, so that's a good thing. It's a good thing that it takes a long time to talk about this shit. It means there's a lot of info here. There's a lot we talked about in the video, so I just want to pass it off to you guys. Just leave your thoughts about anything and everything in the comment section below. Hope you guys enjoyed the video. If you did, give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel if you guys are new and did more Final Fantasy VII Remake content. Turn on my notifications. Follow me on Twitter at @dashingdavid. At my Discord. Links to my social networks are in the description and in the outro. Later, guys.
Used to care what people thought, but now I care more, and nobody out here's got it figured out. So therefore, I've lost all hope of a happy ending, depending on whether or not it's worth it. So insecure, no one's perfect. We spend it with no shame. We blow that like Coltrane. We in here like Rogaine, or leave it like Cobain.